Welcome to Vineyard Boise. It's our vision to make the invisible God visible wherever He places us. We come together on Sundays to worship and fellowship corporately. But we know that church isn't just about Sunday. It's about a lifelong, day-to-day following of Christ with other believers. We invite you to join us, just as you are. If you'd like to support our ministry, visit vineyardboise.org and click the Give Online button.
Well, those baskets are going around. I want to take a minute to clarify a couple things. Last week, we had what was kind of the culmination and then the launching point of our Grace Project. So for 3 weeks, we were together, we were brainstorming and creating a Grace Project for us to participate in as a church. And then last week, we launched it. And so we actually gave anybody who wanted to participate last week, gave you a $100 bill in an envelope and said, okay, this is God's money and your kingdom assignment is to go out, your Grace Project is to go out and to spend this on God's behalf in a way that extends His love, His mercy, His justice into the world. And we did that. So first of all, that Grace Project is closed in the sense of continuing to give out $100 bills. That's not an inexhaustible resource. So if you missed that last week, I'm sorry, but you can't still participate in the sense of getting a $100 bill today. But you can still participate because the reality is it just takes, what we're actually trying to cultivate is a mindset where everything we have belongs to God. Our time, our abilities, our opportunities, our finances, and that we're stewards of those things. We're not owners, we're stewards. And so God, would you show us how to use our lives, how to spend our lives? And so you can do that whether you got the $100 bill last week or not. And you know, in fact, the book that I read from last week, there was a story about one guy. He took his $100 bill because they called it the kingdom assignment. He put it in his wallet, and then he waited for God to give him a nudge to show him something he was supposed to spend that on. And when he found something and he spent it on that, then he replaced it. And so he just lives that way now. He always has a $100 bill in his wallet just waiting for a kingdom assignment. And I think that's such a cool picture of stewardship. So the Grace Project is closed in the sense of new participants, but it's going to be going on for the next 2 months. And so if you got one of those envelopes last week, I would just encourage you to be paying attention to how God would nudge you. If you haven't figured it out yet, that's okay. You've got 2 months. Our family, we've got an envelope. We still haven't figured out what we're supposed to do with ours. But we're just trying to be attentive to those nudges, God, would you show us a need that you want us to be involved in and to bring your kingdom in? So would you consider that? The other thing I wanted to clarify is there was some mixed messages that got sent because a few people were like, wow, the church just must be really flush with cash because they're just like making it rain, you know? And so, no, that's not the message we're trying to send. In fact, if you've been here this summer, we've been pretty transparent that financially we've been under what we projected for our giving for this year. And so we based our budget on what we projected. We're under that, and so we're letting you know that so that if you have a chance to help with that, you can. So the reality is we're actually, on paper, this doesn't make sense. So here's the message. The message is not that we're flush with cash. It's that we're trying to obey God. And when God stirs something in the heart of His people, we don't make a decision based on what the bank ledger says. We say, okay, God, we're going to step out in trust and in obedience and let you meet us there. And we're going to give you what we have. And so that's the message. And I wanted to share that this morning because that's how we're trying to operate as a church. That's how our leadership team is wanting to operate. And that's something that God would call all of us to as Christians in our individual lives, in our homes, in our households, that we would not be making our decisions based on what we have in excess, but that we would take all that we have and say, God, how do you want us to steward this? And God will meet us there and He'll bless us, and that's a wonderful way to live. Okay? There you go. So this morning, I actually have 2 messages for you. And so settle in. Here's the thing. In light, actually, this is really good timing. You know, I just shared with you about our vision retreat. This morning, I want to take the first part of our morning to kind of circle back to our vision retreat from last year and what God stirred in our team and then what we brought to the church in January and how that's been playing out. Because we made a commitment back then in January when we did that, we said, we're embracing as a church a spirit of adventure, of trying new things, of trying new ways to be effective in the mission that God has given us. And that's going to require us to experiment and then to evaluate the experiment and then to adapt based on what we're learning. And so we launched that in January, but we haven't really circled back to say, okay, what are we learning? As we're evaluating the experiment, what are we learning? How are we adapting? And I want to do that this morning, and it was a good day to do it, partly because we're leaving on the Vision Retreat this week, again, but also because this is typically September, like the first Sunday after Labor Day is considered in church world, it's back to church Sunday. It's when people have been traveling throughout the summer and had pretty, random schedules of doing lots of activities, and then people are settling back into a kind of a rhythm of school and all of that, and so you start seeing people show up at church that maybe have been pretty spotty. And so it's a good time for us just to circle back and say, okay, here's where we are. And so if you remember, if you weren't here in January, or if you were but you don't remember, here's our title slide from our series. And this was the imagery that carried us through all the month of January as we were talking about where God was calling us. And we called it going off the map. We also used the language of uncharted territory. And so the imagery there, you can see it's this staring off into this kind of wilderness, this wild expanse, this unknown horizon of uncharted territory. And in that time, we were leaning into a metaphor from Lewis and Clark, the Lewis and Clark expedition from some 200 plus years ago, of them having to confront and adapt their expectations as they were on that expedition. So here was what they had to confront. Their expectation, based on the collective thought of over 300 years of both exploration and even science, was that at the western edge of the Louisiana Purchase, at that time, they had not gone as far west as beyond the Louisiana Purchase. And so basically our nation had been, the Americans had been living in the east. Their expectation was that at the western edge of the Louisiana Purchase, they would find the Continental Divide, a watershed and spine of the Rocky Mountains, beyond which they would find a western flowing water source through a gradual plain that would carry them all the way to the Pacific. So basically what they believed is that the geography in front of them was going to look just like the geography behind them, just in reverse. And so they would do all the hard work and get to this summit, and then it would just be this, they would just coast downhill. And so they carried canoes with them, thinking, well, the canoes have been helpful in our past, and so when we get to the summit, we'll use canoes and they'll take us down. But here's what happened. They arrived at the Continental Divide, and they did not find a gentle slope leading down to the Pacific with a water source. Instead, they saw majestic, jagged, snow-covered mountains as far as the eye could see. And this was a defining moment where they realized we have a choice. We can either confront the fact that our expectations about our future were wrong, and we need to adjust them and embrace a spirit of adventure and experiment and adapt and learn how to do life out there. Or we can go back. They were commissioned by Jefferson. They could go back to Jefferson and say, we can't do that mission. That mission's for somebody else. We need to stay here and just hunker down in what we've known. And so the metaphor is this. The metaphor is that the Christian leaders and churches of 21st century America, we find ourselves at a very parallel moment. We're standing at our own continental divide, and ours is this. It's what sociologists and theologians would refer to as the passing of Christendom. Here's the passing of Christendom. There's been a seismic and fundamental shift in our culture. America is now a post-Christian nation. And all of our experience, our training, our models for how to do ministry did not prepare us for the world in which we now live. Okay? So in other words, in the Western civilization, for the last 1,700 years, Christianity has shared the center of influence. We haven't had sole influence, but Christianity has had a place of influence at the table and been at the very core of influence and culture. And there has been a dramatic shift. It's a shift that already happened in Europe a couple generations ago. And we're now catching up to where Europe's been. But we now live in a post-Christian world, and it's happened rather rapidly, where suddenly Christian influence is suspect and marginalized and not in step with the general culture. And it's not that everybody has been Christians, but there was a lot of things that were kind of agreed upon that, yeah, that's how things should operate. And now we don't have those same general assumptions held by our culture and by our world. And so now here we stand, and all the things that were helpful for church in the past, that were the models that worked, no longer seem to be working. And some of them that we used to be excited about don't excite us anymore. So the question is, are we going to hunker down and try to recreate the past, or isolate ourselves, or are we going to embrace the spirit of adventure and say, God, you're capable of leading us into the future? Will you lead us and show us how to be faithful to our mission? So that's where we stand. We're on our own continental divide. It's one of culture, and we have a choice. Will we adapt our model and allow God to lead us? Our decision as a vision team last year as we went away is we said, let's embrace the adventure. Let's let God show us how to do church, how to be on mission in uncharted territory, going off the map, doing things that we haven't done. How do we reach the culture that he wants us to reach with his love and with his gospel? And so we said, we're gonna go west. So that's where we landed. Here's the mission statement we cultivated together. This is our vision and then the fleshing out of it into mission. Okay, so let me clarify. When we go away on our vision retreat, we're not redefining our vision every year for a new vision. We're asking God for clarity of what the mission looks like this year. So the vision statement doesn't change. The vision statement is we make the invisible God visible. Okay, that comes out of the book of John we were in last week. Jesus came and he showed us what the Heavenly Father was like, and then he commissioned his disciples to do the same thing. He said, as I've done for you, you go and do for others. So that's our mission, is to make the invisible God visible. But how? That changes from season to season. So the current how is by fully and lovingly engaging a post-Christian culture. Now, our pastoral team, we wrestled through this, and we did that statement together. Every word of that is packed. Like every word of that, fully and lovingly engaging a post-Christian culture, there's meaning to all of that we're not going to unpack this morning. But I want to talk for a minute about the fully engaging part. Okay, so the fully engaging, here's what that looks like. We said, you know what, we need to move, and beginning with our Sunday experience, which is the time that we're all together, and then that colors the rest of our life as a church. Our Sunday experience needs to move from what's largely a spectator experience into a participatory experience. Okay, spectator experience means that we have a worship team, and they lead us, and there's participation. We respond in worship. We're the choir. But then after that, it's usually a monologue, and it's a bunch of people listening and watching. That's not the most effective teaching model. That's not how we actually learn. All the sociologists and researchers would tell us that's not actually how we learn. So we said, we need to be more collaborative, and we need to do that first as a staff. And so what you've seen over this last year is you're seeing more and more people involved, more people bringing their gifts, their talents, who they are into our life together, and that we're more fully participating as a staff. Behind the scenes, we're also doing that. We're collaborating together when we're studying the passage together on Sundays. I don't just study the passage all by myself, or whoever's teaching it doesn't study all by themselves. We actually have a time where we meet together to talk about the passage, what we're learning from it, what God's speaking to us. Then we have another team that comes together to actually say, okay, if that's the message, how can we creatively engage people in that? How can we engage more than just the mind, but also emotions and heart and the senses? Like, how can we be creative with it? So we embraced more kinetic learning. Exercises, learning how to learn, train, equip, and send people. We've been more intentional about building time and space for relating with one another. It used to be that after worship, we would say, okay, shake somebody's hand and then sit down, basically. And now we're actually building some time into the morning where we get to engage with other people, whether it's friends or family or strangers. We get to connect. And lastly, we recognized that we needed to move from rows into circles. And the language of rows and circles is language we've had for a long time. We've said in Sunday we meet on rows. You also need a circle of people that you're meeting with face-to-face in your life. And at that vision retreat, we said, what if we stopped apologizing that on Sunday we meet in rows, and what if we actually turned our rows into circles? And that's why you're now sitting at a table today. And the reality is, what I want to clarify is our mission and vision was never to be a church with tables. That no part of our vision statement is be a church with tables. Okay? That's easy, it's a low bar, it has nothing to do with missionality. But it is a model that's more effective than sitting in rows. So let me share with you some of the values of it that drove us to do it. Here are some of the positives. Tables foster an environment for connecting across generational gaps and racial divides. When we were sitting in rows, you could come into this room, just like going to a movie theater, and never engage with the person sitting in front of you or behind you. And so if there was any sort of barrier to that, it was just like, well, there was no discomfort in simply coming and having an isolated experience. But what we recognize is that in a fractured world that we live in, we need to be intentional, to be bridge builders, to be reaching across differences and finding out that we actually have a lot in common, and let's connect and love one another. And so whether that's a generational divide, we've had people say, you know what, we're an older couple and there was a younger couple sitting at our table, and if we'd been in rows, we would have never tried to talk with them, but because they're at our table, it was awkward to not talk to them. And what we found out is we actually had a lot in common. And what looked like differences because there was a generational difference, we actually found out that there was stuff in common, and we liked meeting together. In fact, we exchanged phone numbers so we can connect. There's this racial divide that's awakened in our nation. And we can sit with one another and talk and share stories, just like when Josh asked us the question this morning and said, hey, have you ever made a difficult move? And as we meet together, even if there's apparent differences on the outside, you share those stories, we find out, oh, you know what? I've experienced what you've experienced too. We actually have some things in common. And so that happens at tables in a way that it can't happen in rows. Secondly, tables allow us to be more deliberate in creating a culture of hospitality and inclusiveness. Okay? This doesn't automatically happen, but you're invited to do this. To not just think about yourself when you come to church and think about, am I comfortable, but to be looking out for others. To look for the person walking in who goes, what is going on here? Or they're walking through and they're looking for a table to sit at, that you can say, hey, there's space at my table. Would you come and sit with me? I'd love to have you. Or to look around and see somebody who's sitting at a table by themselves and say, hey, would you like to join us? You're welcome. We've got an empty seat. Not out of pressure, but just to say welcome, okay? What we're finding is that new people moving from out of state coming here who are hungry for relationship, who are looking for, how do I connect with people? I've moved to a new city and I don't know how to connect people. They're saying, I love the tables. I didn't come to church and just have a spiritual experience. I had a social one too. I connected. So they foster that. Tables also create a way to address the relational malnourishment that is growing in our digital world. I'm going to read that again. Tables create a way to address the relational malnourishment that is growing in a digital world. Okay, this comes from a conversation I had with a friend, and he said, you know what? His granddaughter was living with he and his wife for a period of time, and he said, I think she's about 3 years old, and he said the challenge with her is that she only wants to eat Cheerios. That's all she'll eat. And we try to give her fruit and cheese and meat and vegetables, and we've tried all kinds of things. She wants nothing except Cheerios. And the problem is the Cheerios, they satiate her hunger. She gets hungry, she wants to eat something, she gets Cheerios, and then she's no longer hungry. But she's not thriving on the Cheerios. She doesn't have the balance in her diet to where she's actually thriving. And applying that to the digital world in which we live, we have all kinds of connection that is basically relational Cheerios, right? It satiates our hunger. We are hardwired by God from creation before the fall to have meaningful connection with one another. In the creation before the fall happened, when you look at the creation story in Genesis 1 and 2, everything's good. God's made everything, and before the fall happens, he looks around and he says, there's one thing that's not good. He says, it's not good for a man to be alone. And what that means is that he has hardwired us for meaningful connection, not just with him, but with each other. And a lot of what we do on here doesn't actually satisfy that. It satiates the hunger so we don't have the same social need that we would without this. And what happens is we can spend all day, I can spend all day connecting with people digitally, email, Facebook, all kinds of stuff like that, whatever it is, but not really have face-to-face connection. And then when I get an opportunity for face-to-face connection, my hunger is satiated. I'm like, you know what, I'm tired. I just can't have another conversation. Tables allow us to engage that. Social researchers are watching this whole technology culture play out, and here's what they're saying. As a nation, as a culture, and this is not just the young people, this is every span of generation, we're losing the ability, we're forgetting how to have face-to-face connections with people. And so if we're to be a countercultural people, actually embracing who God's made us to be, we need a model that allows us to do that. Tables are more conducive to it. Lastly, tables allow for participation and for collaboration. Participation, what educational researchers would tell us is that we learn better when we're kinetic, when we're doing something active. And so the tables foster a way that we can stop and talk about what we're learning. We can do an exercise together. The boxes on your table, they're not just about pencils and offering envelopes. They're distribution points where we can say, hey, okay, reach into your box and pull out this worksheet. We're going to do this together. And it's a way that we can make the morning more participatory, more collaborative, okay? That's the way the educational model is going. If we are going to reach a generation that is currently in our school system, whether that's elementary up through university, the educational system is collaborative. It's done in cohorts. And so if we're going to reach them, we've got to meet them where they are, okay? So that's some of the positives, right? Some of the positives about tables. And here's why I'm talking about tables. It's not because our mission is to be a church with tables. Tables and engaging with one another has become the flashpoint. It's the point that people most regularly experience and feel the need to form opinions about. And so from the moment we introduced tables, we've had people that loved them and think, this is awesome. Why didn't we do this years ago? And we actually did. We started as a church with tables. We just drifted. And then people that don't like them. So here's some of the negatives. First of all, many people don't like them. For some, it can trigger the anxiety of walking into the middle school lunchroom. Where do I sit? Will anybody allow me to sit with them? And that's a genuine thing, right? And that's why we can, if we're intentional about creating a culture of hospitality, we can look around for the people that are looking like that and say, would you come sit at my table? We'd love to have you join us, right? So for many people, it triggers that. For introverts, many introverts have experienced the tables and the connection questions, like share with somebody your answer to this question. Many introverts have experienced it as uncomfortable, okay? I am an introvert, so I get it. In fact, out of our family of 4, 3 of us are pretty strong on the introvert scale. If you look at like Myers-Briggs, I'm a 20 on the scale, between 20 and 0. I'm an extreme introvert. Here's what that means. It means I can be social with people and be present and connect with people. When I'm done, I'm spent. I need to recharge. And so on a day when I've been here and I've been talking with people all day, where I just bounce from meeting to meeting, just talking and listening to people all day, I go home and without even thinking about it, I start closing all the blinds. And Andrea's like, it's 6 o'clock, there's 3 more hours of daylight. The plants like some sunshine. What are you doing? And I go, I guess I just need to like pull in a little bit. So I get it. But let me suggest something. We're having our comfort zone stretched. I don't believe that Jesus ever said that discipleship would be comfortable. In fact, I'm pretty sure he told us that it was going to be like picking up your cross and following him. That there's a certain discomfort we embrace in this world as disciples of Jesus for the sake of the mission. And so just the fact that it makes us uncomfortable, that it's a comfort zone stretch, I don't think that is necessarily something that we should push back from. On the other hand, the extroverts are not off the hook, because I've talked to some extroverts who I would have thought would like the tables, and they say, you know what, I don't like being controlled. Why are you telling me where to sit? Why are you telling me to talk to somebody and answer this question? I'm not going to do it. Which, this posture of anger and defiance is not real helpful to worship or learning, right? If you're sitting there gritting your teeth. I had this conversation with a pastor friend of mine who pastors another church, and I was telling him what we were doing. We were getting caught up, and I told him what we were doing. And he said, my wife would never do that. She would hate your church. She would sit there and say, don't tell me what to do, okay? Again, part of discipleship is surrendering lordship. It's not being in control of our own lives. Many extroverts don't like being controlled. And so here's the rub. There's a lot of people over the last 9 months who've left. And all of us feel the pain. If you know someone who's left because of the tables, you feel the pain. And many of you have reached out and said, hey, this family left, or this person left. This person I used to come to church with won't come anymore. My spouse won't come anymore. And it's painful. I just want to tell you, I feel that pain as much as you do. Maybe more so because I get it every week from different people. And people I dearly love have disengaged here to find a new faith community. And so it's painful, and as a result of that, one of the suggestions we've been getting, and we've had, mostly anonymous feedback, which, by the way, anonymous feedback really isn't very helpful. Because here's what happens. You write an anonymous email, or Vmail to us, the little sheets in the box. If you make those anonymous, you give us feedback, we can't respond to you, we can't reach out and connect, and so then it feels to you like we just ignored you. And we don't have a way to connect. So we've had anonymous feedback, people saying things like, bring back the pews. So I was like, well, you mean Larry and Nancy pew? Because they were here first service, right? It's really funny, though. We've never had pews. In fact, at our very first building, we had pews in that building. It was the church up on Northview. Pastor Tri literally took all the pews and stacked them up at the back of the stage and built a wall to hide them. And we had tables. When we brought tables back into this room, it's not a matter of going back. It's where we feel God's called us to go. So bring back pews. We've had people suggest, well, what if you set up half the room in circles and half of the room in rows, and then let us decide? Or what if you set up a different environment? Maybe set up the chapel in a more traditional seating in rows, and then simulcast the service here. But here's the thing: we're using these tables as a distribution point for exercises, as a way to foster connection, as a way to say, okay, talk with the people at your table and answer this question. What happens if we're sitting in rows and we do that? That's really awkward. Okay, we're actually building this into our model. So what I want to share with you just for a moment is what we're learning. Again, this is not our mission, but it is the model we think is more helpful to our mission. And I want to share with you some things that we are learning as we're evaluating and then adapting. So number one, we as a church, we need to be better at communicating the reasons and the boundaries that are going to happen on our Sunday mornings. Okay, the reasons is that I can't stand here every Sunday and take time to explain, hey, this is why we're sitting at tables, because it's like for most of you just get like, why does he always do this? But new people come in and they don't know why. And your friends come and they don't know why. And so we've added a section to our bulletin. It's on the second page currently. It's a little colored page that says, why tables? And it explains, this is the heart behind this. This is the intentionality of why we're sitting in tables. So if you see a person walk in and they have that look like, why does this look like a banquet room? Right? Did I just walk into a banquet? You can point out, no, this is why. You can just point at them, even during worship. You can say, here's why we do this. Or if you're inviting a friend, I'd encourage you to invite a friend. You can say, hey, at our church, we do things a little bit differently. We sit at tables, here's why. Here's what you can expect. So there's a communication piece, but there's also this boundary piece. And what I've realized as I talk with different people is people push back because they don't know what to expect. They don't know how vulnerable they'll be asked to be. Like, you're going to ask me to interact with somebody, and I don't know what the level of exposure is. And if I think about the things that I've done where I've gone to like a seminar where I knew this was about doing some interior work and I was going to have to be vulnerable with people, there's anxiety with that. Like, there's a big unknown there. I don't know what that's going to be like. So I want to tell you, we're going to invite you to engage in a way that's appropriate based on the relationship, okay? So there's people that I relate with very intimately. I share things that would be inappropriate for me to share with a complete stranger. It wouldn't be helpful. We're not going to ask you to share those types of things. We're going to give you questions like we gave you this morning. Have you ever made a move? Here's the filter we're using for those questions so that you know when you come in, you may not know what the question's going to be, but it's not going to be out of bounds. We use these filters. We say, would I know how to answer this question? Could a visitor or a non-Christian answer this question comfortably? We don't want to make people feel like outsiders with our questions, right? Could a non-visitor or could a visitor or a non-Christian answer this question? And could this question, how does it prep us for the message? Every question in some way, it kind of prepares us for where we're going that morning. So I say that to say, I realize when you come, there's a certain amount of vulnerability that you're embracing. You don't know, you're going to be invited to interact with people, and you don't really know what that's going to look like. I'm just going to tell you, we are going to try and be trustworthy with that. We're not going to ask you to stretch in a way that's inappropriate, okay? Second, we need to reframe the experience of forced interaction. If there's a word that I've heard or read more than any about the interactions we're having, is people say, my spouse or my friend or I don't like the forced interaction. And I'd like us to reframe and use a different F word. Fostered we're fostering relationship. We're facilitating relationship. If you experience it as forced, that's happening inside of you. Okay, we're going to invite you. We're going to create an environment where you get to connect with somebody. We're going to facilitate it by giving you a question where you get to dialogue with a stranger about a question that you can ask them, and you'll find that you actually have points of commonality with them. We're going to help you connect across racial barriers, across generational barriers. We're facilitating that. If you choose to experience it as forced, that's up to you. But I'm inviting you, would you reframe that within your own heart and mind so that you're not having to deal with the anxiety and with the pushback. Third, we need to encourage appropriate stretching of our comfort zones. We said this at the beginning of January. We said, here's the thing about comfort zones. We think that they keep us safe, but what they actually do is they keep us small. And I don't think that the fact that our comfort zones are being stretched is necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I hope all of our comfort zones are being stretched because we're becoming more like Jesus. Jesus was outward focused. I don't think Jesus promised our discipleship would be comfortable. He didn't gather the disciples when he sent out the 12 or when he sent out the 70. He didn't gather them and say, okay, all the extroverts I need over here because I'm going to send you. All the introverts, you can just stay over here and keep worshiping. He sent them out, and all of them had to stretch their comfort zones in some way. If we're going to be a sent people, it's going to stretch us. But we are individuals, and it's not a one-size-fits-all model. And so here's what I want to say that I wish we would have said from the very beginning, is you can take care of yourself. You know what you need. You know how much stretching you can handle. So take care of yourself. We've provided smaller tables around the edges of the room where the exposure is 2 people, not potentially 8. That's kind of a soft landing spot. If you come in and you're not used to this, you can sit there as long as you need to. But I would invite you at some point, come into the middle of the room, right? We're not that scary. Secondly, there's almost always tables on this side of the room that are less populated or even empty. And so if you come and you know, I can't handle meeting with strangers today, you can sit there by yourself. You can stack the deck with your friends and family. I mean, the reason we have table numbers is so you can connect with one another and say, hey, I'm going to be sitting at table 23 today. And you can actually sit with friends and family. I've seen families using the tables as a discipleship environment, where whole families, parents, kids, are sitting together and they're talking about what God's teaching them. And so it's actually a discipleship environment. So take care of yourself. We're not trying to force anything on anybody, but we are inviting you to see things differently. I'd encourage you to think like Kevin and Renee did. A few weeks ago, we showed a video of Kevin and Renee, and they were a couple who said, yeah, we didn't like the tables at first, but we prayed and asked God how he would have us respond, and he gave us an idea, and when we acted on it, it was really cool. And so we didn't show that to say you should all do what Kevin and Renee did, but the part about them saying, you know what, we're going to listen to God and ask him what he would have for us, that's what we can all model. Lastly, we need to embrace the truth that while our culture may be individualistic, our call has always been to community. Our culture, we live in a culture where we are hardwired and our worldview is very individualistic. We make our decisions without even thinking about it like consumers. Am I happy? Do I like this? What do I need? Are my needs being met? That impacts our marriages. It impacts the way we come to church. And God has not called us to an individualistic experience. He's called us into community. I want you to look at every metaphor that we could think of from the New Testament. It has to do with the way that we're connected together as Christians. Okay, these are the metaphors for the church throughout the New Testament. Body, building, temple, priesthood, army, family, field, workforce, flock, household, nation. The only one I could think of that even touched on individualistic was bride. And it's never used in an individual way. It's to say you are the bride of Christ. He's coming back to get his bride, to get you. So we're called into community. I had a Vmail. It was an anonymous one. I only got this once, but probably many of you could have written it. Many of us could have written it. It said, I come to church to worship God, not to talk to strangers. I want you to think about that. And in light of those metaphors, can we put those back up? if we're unwilling to connect with one another in a social question that allows us to connect and share a human experience, if we're not willing to do that, that's not the spirituality God's called us to. And here's the thing, we're called to be salt and light in the world. We're called to take what happens in here and take it out there. And if we can't relate with a stranger in here, what's the chance that we're going to be salt and light out there? Honestly. So yes, our comfort zones, most of us are having our comfort zone stretched in some way. I would just encourage you that having your comfort zone stretched doesn't mean you need to disengage. You may need to. And you know what? There's wonderful, awesome churches, different corners of God's pasture all over this valley that meet in rows. And if that's what you need, if that's what God's calling you to, then we're going to bless you in that. But I want to suggest that just because you're uncomfortable doesn't mean that that's what God's calling you to. So ask him. All right. I'll close with this. Our mission matters more than our comfort. Our mission matters more than our comfort. Okay. Here's our title slide. That was part one. I'm going to briefly launch into Peter. This fall, moving towards Christmas, we're going to be in two letters that the Apostle Peter wrote. They're actually, in the 21st century American church, they're not very popular letters. Not necessarily meaning they're unpopular, they're just not ones that we go to. In fact, the last time I taught 1 Peter was 25 years ago. And this morning, Calvin reminded me. Calvin is working in the sound booth this morning, and he said, remember when you first came back from Bible school and Pastor Try didn't know if he could trust your theology yet, so he had you teach Bible study to the staff? He said, I was unemployed at the time. I sat in on that one. And that was 1 Peter. That's the last time I taught it. It was 25 years ago. So it's not really popular, but let me tell you this. In parts of the world where the church is more marginalized and under persecution, it is one of the most popular New Testament letters. And so as we shift into a time of uncharted territory and we're finding our footing in a time where we've lost the center of influence, which may in fact be a good thing, it may be a letter that's really relevant for us. So here's a little bit of background to it. First of all, the author's Peter. That's one of Jesus' inner three. If you can dial up to your awareness as we go through this book, the things that you know about Peter from the Gospels, about things that the encounters he had with Jesus, his denial, things that Jesus said to him, Peter, on this rock I will build my church. If you can think about the types of things that he had with Jesus, it's going to help you as you read this letter to really understand the heart that he's writing it from. Secondly, the date is about 64 AD. That means it's over 30 years since Jesus' resurrection. And Peter's now an older man. You know, he's a very young, impulsive guy in the Gospels. Now he's an old, impulsive guy. He's not really that old. He's in his 50s. But here's the reality. Christians in the first maybe 100 years after Jesus' resurrection, after Jesus' earthly life, experienced three specific persecutions that were actually enacted by the current administration. Okay, so there was Nero was the first one, then there was Domitian, was a little bit later in the 90s, and then later was Trajan. And during those three times, persecution of Christians in the Greco-Roman world was it was a policy. In between those administrations, Christians didn't have favor. They were basically social outliers, and they were considered a minority group that was despised. So Peter's currently living and dying in that first one. He's going to die under the Neronian persecution. And so here's what happened with Nero. In 64 AD, a fire ravaged Rome, but suspiciously left the estates of Nero and his close friend unscathed. So I don't remember the exact percentage, but a vast majority of Rome was destroyed by this fire. But there was this little pocket, and it was the estate of Nero and his best friend. Those got spared. And so people started wondering. And the thing is, he was just narcissistic enough that he might have done this, lit this fire intentionally in order to rebuild Rome according to his own design. And so people began to say that. And so he needed to deflect the blame. And so he was needing a scapegoat upon whom he could shift the blame. Nero accused the Christians in Rome of having started the fire. And so what began in 64 was this brutal campaign during which literally thousands of Christians were murdered. The historian, second century historian Tacitus, who himself disliked Christians, there's no reason for him to pad this story. He disliked Christians, but he said, here's what Nero did. He said he did things like lighting Christians on fire and burning them like torches in his garden parties. He killed other Christians by feeding them to wild animals. He would sew them in skins of wild animals and then let other animals tear them apart for entertainment. Christians already held in suspicion by the general population were an easy target. Here's how Christians were viewed in their day. Romans generally viewed Christians as antisocial because of their refusal to participate in the festivals devoted to the Greco-Roman gods. They were called atheists for their devotion to one God. Like, who does that? Atheists, right? They were atheists for devotion to one God. They were considered cannibals. Can you imagine why? Because they claimed to be eating Jesus' body and drinking his blood. Christians were considered a fanatical deviation from Judaism. Judaism was well entrenched and established. There was a lot of adherence to Judaism. But Christians were this subset that were considered almost like a cult, like a fanatical minority. And so they were very easy to become that target. So that's the situation. The audience is Christians living throughout the Roman province of Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. So as you read through the letter, if you pay attention to the things that Peter says about who they used to be, when he describes their pre-Christian life, he describes things that most fit a Gentile audience, which means you had Jews and you had non-Jews or Gentiles. That was basically the classification in the Roman world. And he's writing to an audience that is predominantly Gentile. Here's where he's writing them to. If you put up this map, if you look at the right-hand side, all the ones that are written in red there, Galatia, Bithynia, Cappadocia, Asia, he's writing a circular letter to be carried from church to church in each of those places in that province. And the situation is this, writing from Rome, so Peter's in Rome, and it's almost universally agreed upon that Peter was crucified in Rome by Nero under his persecution. In the early part of that Neronian persecution, he died. So he's going to die there, but he writes his letter to Christians who are already experiencing suffering throughout the empire, and he expects it to intensify. Okay? Peter writes to strengthen their resolve to be faithful, to help them know how to live in such times. And here's the thing, this is the very thing that Jesus commissioned him to do when Jesus warned him about his own betrayal. When Jesus said, when the roosters crowed 3 times, before that even happens, you will have denied me. Look at the way it says in Luke. Luke 22, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you that he might sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. Jesus said to Peter, Peter, tonight in fear, you're going to turn away from your faith. You're going to deny me in order to try and save your own skin. But I've prayed for you that the turn won't be devastating, that you will be restored in your faith. And when you have, use what's happened to you to go and strengthen others. So this letter, even though it's some 30 years later, this is Peter's response of knowing how it felt to want to deny Jesus out of fear of social pressure, and to say, you can do it, and here's why. He's helping them. Peter's written to help these Christians understand how to live in a hostile environment. With that in mind, I believe that 1 Peter is also a timely letter for the post-Christian church of 21st century America. Just think about this. Peter's written to a people who are no longer at the center of cultural influence and are in fact on the margins of what is considered normative. It's written to a people perceived as abnormal by the surrounding culture because of their lifestyle choices and their behavior. It's written to a people whose beliefs and the corresponding lifestyle are out of sync with the prevailing wind of politics, culture, and entertainment. And they're having to choose how they will respond, how they will live. Here's the type of choices they're faced with, and ones that face us as well. Will they conform and be absorbed into the culture so as not to face the unpleasantness of being social, political, and economic outsiders? Will they conform and be absorbed by the culture so as not to face the unpleasantness of being social, political, or economic outsiders? Will they seek to control by securing influence in the political sphere and legislating their beliefs and values on others? Or will they quarantine and separate themselves away from culture in a self-protective seclusion so as to stay faithful? Those are some extreme options that are before them. And now Peter writes this letter to say, here's how to live as basically a counterculture within the culture in which you live. I'm going to read just the opening paragraph. It's actually, after the first two verses, it's actually one long run-on sentence. I'm not going to comment on it. I just want you to listen to it. And Peter's going to introduce all of the themes that then he's going to unpack throughout the letter. So listening to it through those lenses of who they are, of what they're dealing with, listen to what Peter says and how he begins to anchor them into a different reality that's deeper than just where they're living. 1 Peter 1:1. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, in the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ and for sprinkling with his blood, may grace and peace be multiplied to you. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, unfading, kept in heaven for you, who by God's power are being guarded through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you've been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though tested by fire, may be found to result to praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him, and you rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory. You're obtaining the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Concerning this salvation, the prophets who prophesied about the grace that was to be yours searched and inquired carefully. They were inquiring of what person or what time the Spirit of Christ in them was indicating when he predicted the sufferings of Christ and his subsequent glory. It was revealed to them that they were serving not themselves but you, and the things that have now been announced to you through those who preach the good news to you by the Holy Spirit sent from heaven, things into which angels long to look. This is God's word. There's so much there, whole messages we could unpack there. I just want one takeaway this morning. There's one takeaway that I think if you grab onto this, it's going to shape the way that you read this whole letter as we study through it with our devotions. We got our weekly devotions are in the back of the room. You can pick those up as you leave today. Those are going to help you to encounter God one-on-one in your devotional time. As we engage devotionally, as we engage on Sundays, here's the one thing that's going to help you understand that. It's how Peter addressed them. I underlined it on that first verse. It said, Peter to the exiles of the dispersion. Let me unpack that. Exiles, this was a technical term that Jewish people used when speaking of Jews who lived outside of Palestine. Okay, there's the little strip of Israel that we're familiar with seeing in our Bibles. If you lived outside of that, you were considered exiles of the dispersion, the scattered. It borrows from Old Testament imagery, like when people of Israel were carried off into exile in Babylon. There was two exiles, actually, one to Assyria and one to Babylon. The nations that are left at this time in Israel's history were the ones that had been carried off to Babylon. Their ancestors had been. They were taken away from their homeland, placed in a very hostile world that did not reflect their values or their God or their culture. And they were told to, while you're here, while you're waiting to get back to your homeland, bless the place where I've sent you. Don't take a posture of hostility towards it. Don't try and call down fire on it. Bring the values of your homeland into the place of your exile. So now Peter's writing to these guys, and he's calling them exiles of the dispersion, but he's applying it to Gentiles. He's taking a Jewish term, and he's going to do this throughout the letter. He's going to take a whole lot of stuff from the Old Testament that is Old Testament Jewish imagery, and he's going to apply it to the church. And what he says is, you need to live like you're exiles. That though geographically you might still live in the same place, spiritually you're exiles. The homeland of your heart has been rewired. You've been moved. You've been displaced. You know what I did the first service? I forgot to do it to you. The only reason it didn't happen to you is because I forgot. Between messages, I had them stand, and I said, while you're standing, would you move one seat to your right? I'm not forcing you, I'm just facilitating you finding a new seat. But I wanted people to experience displacement. Our creative team said, let's help people experience displacement in some way. Peter's writing to people that haven't been carried out of their homeland, but their hearts have been displaced. And he's saying, you need to live according to what's in your heart. And you need to bring the values and the reality of your final homeland into being right where you live. This is true of all Christians. All Christians who've been born again to a living hope. That's the way Peter phrases it. You've been born again to a living hope. What's happened to us is that we still live in our homeland, but a new homeland has been birthed in our hearts. We're now exiles, longing for the goodness of our true homeland, living as citizens of that homeland throughout the time of our exile. Christians, in a sense, have dual citizenship, but our compass is set to our true homeland. And we are to live in ways that reflect our destination. We're to live in ways that honor the king of our true homeland. To be a Christian is to be countercultural, always seeking to bring the life of the homeland into whatever present pervasive culture we live in during our exile. So that's what the author of Hebrews says. The author of Hebrews makes a distinction between exiles and refugees. Refugees, we're a nation that has embraced refugees. We're a church that has embraced refugees. Typically speaking, refugees come, they leave their homeland in search of a better land. Exiles have been displaced and they're longing for the homeland. This is what the author of Hebrews says. He picks up the same metaphor. He said, all these people died, all the heroes of the faith, still believing what God had promised them. They didn't receive what it was promised yet, but they saw it from a distance and they welcomed it. They agreed that they were foreigners and exiles here on earth. Obviously, people who say such things are looking forward to a country they can call their own. If they'd longed for the country they came from, they could have gone back, but they were looking for a better place, a heavenly homeland. That is why God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So how do we navigate this displacement? How do we live as countercultural people, not trying to isolate from a culture that is becoming more hostile towards Christians, but as salt and light to the culture, bringing the economy of our homeland into the culture, reflecting the love of God, the gospel of Jesus Christ in the place of our exile. That's what we're called to. So here's what Paul said, or what Peter says to them. He says it's through worship. Let's go back to verse 1, 8, and 9. You love him even though you've never seen him. Though you do not see him now, you trust him. And you rejoice with a glorious, inexpressible joy. He's writing to people that are experiencing persecution. He says, and in the midst of that, you rejoice with a glorious, inexpressible joy. The reward of trusting him will be the salvation of your souls. As we close this morning, I just want to invite you. The worship team's going to come, and they're going to lead us in a song that just makes a little bit of space for us to pause and think about our own identity. And as they lead us, here's what I'd invite you to consider is, how do you self-identify? If I ask you, who are you? And there's levels to that. There's our nationality. There's our generational identity. There's our racial identity, our family identity, our social identity. There's so many ways that we can think about ourselves. Peter's calling them a new name. It's kind of like when I call you saints on Sunday. I'm calling out the reality of who God says you are. Peter writes to them and he calls them exiles. So I'm calling you to live differently. Live from the values of the homeland. Put your anchor down that your primary identity is as children of the living God, waiting for your final family. So as the team leads us, just would you think about that? And if you find that your primary orientation is not that you're a Christian, if your primary citizenship is American, or your primary political distinction is whether you're a Democrat or Republican, would you maybe ask God to set that aside in your heart? One of the functions of the Holy Spirit is to rewire our hearts, to give us hearts of flesh, to take out the idolatry. And maybe for some of us, those things have become too important to us. And the most important thing is to think of ourselves as citizens of a heavenly kingdom and to live that out now. Would you take that to God in prayer? Heavenly Father, we can sing that with confidence, not because we are so capable of following you, but because you have sent your empowering grace into our hearts. Would you empower us to live faithfully, to live with our hearts in our homeland, and to live with our lives in the place of our exile, to bring your salt and light into the world, to carry your love, to be filled with your love, to overflow with your love to others. Would you lead us into uncharted territory? Would you take us on this adventure and show us how to stay on mission, not turning back because of the difficulties, not turning back because things have changed, but allowing you to lead us. Take us in places we've not gone before. And all the while, would you shape Jesus in us? In your name, amen.